Hi, I'm Douglas Estes, Associate Professor of Religion at New College of Florida.
And I'm Alicia Mercado-Harvey, Assistant Professor of Spanish, Portuguese, and History.
And I'm Jeffrey Hanson, Associate Professor of Philosophy here at New College.
And welcome, Jeff. We have you for the first time, but we also want to tell our viewers and listeners that this is our also co-host. He's going to start co-hosting from here on, so welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot.
And I guess we'll start at first question, right? You're a professor of philosophy. So you came from Harvard. Right? So I wanted to ask you, how is that coming from Harvard to New College?
Yeah, well, at Harvard, I was there for 8 years as the founding member of an interdisciplinary research group. So it was a great experience, and it really expanded my abilities in research. So I was working with empirical social scientists as well as other philosophers for several years, and really sort of broadened out from my training into areas of things like philosophy of work and philosophy of meaningful life. And so those were topics that I was not educated in necessarily, but as a result of the collaborative work I was doing at the Human Flourishing Program, I got interested in some new areas of investigation. But I also didn't teach regularly, and I missed the classroom quite a bit. So being back here is an opportunity to be in the classroom once again and teaching, students regularly. So it's a change of pace, right? But it's allowing me to go back to what I love, which is teaching in the classroom, more routinely. So
great. I know that one of your areas of specialization is phenomenology. It's cool sounding, but break it down for us. What is phenomenology? Why should students come to New College and study phenomenology?
Well, a shorthand way of putting it might be that it's the examination of the experience of experience itself, right? It's interested in human experience and the structures that underlie it and that make it what it is. So in some ways, we can attribute its sort of foundation to Edmund Husserl right at the turn of the century, who I think in some ways was trying to solve a kind of modern impasse in epistemology, trying to resolve the problem of how do we, or can we, square what we have in our minds with sort of the things that are outside of our experience, right? So Descartes famously sort of says, well, I have an idea, right, of something in my mind which may or may not match the contents outside the mind or the world around us, and that becomes a perennial problem for early modern philosophy. And Husserl, in some ways, I think, breaks that impasse by insisting that consciousness is, as he put it in one of his writings, is not a bag or a box, right? Consciousness is not somehow an empty content-filled box or container, right, for experience, but consciousness is always already consciousness of something. And so it's not a question of, say, a gap between my internal mental states and the external affairs in the world around us, but rather the fact that consciousness already is the bridge between those things, right? And so he tries to dissolve a kind of epistemological problem and at the same time place the ability to know on different foundations, right? So where we're actually examining the structures of experience themselves, not just sort of what it's like to feel or sense or remember or judge or evaluate, right? But what are the structures of human consciousness that make it possible for us to do any of those things in the first place?
Yeah. It seems like one of the most important things that humans experience is love. And you've recently published an article on loving Kierkegaard, or Kierkegaard's view of love, I think.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is a perennial problem in the philosophy of love that I've recently tried to address. My work in Kierkegaard has gone on for a long time. It's probably one of my primary areas of expertise, the 19th century Danish existentialist philosopher. And I wrote a lot about his theory of faith for a while. I have a book about Fear and Trembling, his most sort of popular and influential work. And then at some point I started investigating what he has to say about love in a later book, a very long book called Works of Love. And so I've been writing about that aspect of his thought a lot more recently. And in particular, there's kind of a perennial issue about how do we understand the relationship between, say, our obligations to love our neighbors, which Kierkegaard construes in a sort of universal way, right? He thinks that we're obliged to love everyone, right, as our neighbor. and to love them as ourselves, right? And so he's keying off of the scriptural commandment, of course. But we also have relationships that are of a more particular or preferential sort, right? That there are people in our lives that we love kind of uniquely, right? And we take it that we're not obliged to them in exactly the same way, right, as we are to our neighbors. And one way of trying to understand the relationship between these two kinds of love, if you want to call it that, is to think about how our preferential loves, or our loves for sort of close family, friends, can be kind of morally corrected, right, by a certain kind of love of neighbor, right? So that it's not just that I love my children or my spouse as my child or my spouse, but I also love them as my neighbor. And I think he thinks that solves a couple of problems, right? One of which is our tendency when we love people who are close to us or are special to us to overlook their faults, right? Or to allow them to get away with things that perhaps they ought not to, morally speaking, because they're special to us and we don't want to criticize them, right? Or call them out. And also because I think he's worried that there's a danger in preferring certain people over others, that we will fail then to extend love to our neighbors simply because they're not part of that intimate sort of inner circle, you might say. So I think he thinks there's a role to play for neighbor love to correct our tendency to be exclusionary, right, with respect to our special beloveds. My argument is that actually that has to go both ways. I think for Kierkegaard, it has to be the case that our love of our neighbors is not merely something like the performance of a duty, right? It's not merely something that we can meet by sort of satisfying some kind of ethical standard, or like we can sort of content ourselves with having, say, discharged our duty in some kind of rigoristic moral fashion. But actually that the love of our neighbors needs to look a little bit more like our love for our special preferred beloveds. That we ought to treat our neighbors, not merely as the object of our, say, charitable concern, or not merely as someone that we can discharge our obligation to by simply meeting some kind of minimum moral threshold, but that we ought to really treat our neighbors as not just strangers, right, or someone unfamiliar to us, but with something of the flavor or tenor of the way in which we love people who are close to us. And that really, I think he thinks when we fully developed ourselves in the life of love, that's the way it's going to look, right? That the way we love even our neighbors will be spontaneous, will be free, will be joyful, right? And not something that you have to sort of make yourself do, right, through kind of inner moral gumption, right, through gritted teeth, right, or something as if it were an obligation that had to be satisfied instead of an opportunity to really enjoy love of another.
Right. And this is really critical for where we're at today as Western societies is, how do we love our neighbor, and how do we agree and disagree with people that maybe we don't agree with, or, that we are challenged by, or we challenge them.
I think so, and he has a number of discourses included in that large book, Works of Love, some of which are even more pointedly relevant, right? There's one that, for example, where he speaks of the obligation that we have to love the neighbors that we see, and I think he believes that we have a tendency to love not others as we see them, but rather as we wish they were, right? And so we sort of tend to want to love an idealized version of our neighbor, or someone who has changed themselves in such a way as to be more palatable to us first, and then we think we can love them, right? But he says really that to love our neighbor is to love the neighbor that we encounter, right? And that may mean sort of someone who is in certain respects difficult to love, right? Or unlovable in some ways, right? Yeah. And so I think what he believes really is that we have a tendency spontaneously to love others insofar as they solicit our own self-love, right? We love something about the way they impress us, right? Or there's something about the way they are attractive to me, right? And that there's really no way around that, right? I think he thinks we can't not begin that way, right? But in a sense, to really love another person, right, is to love them not, I would say, quantitatively more than I love myself, right? But to love them in full, right? To really love them for the whole of who they are, even those parts of themselves that maybe don't impress me or solicit my admiration or appeal to some instinct in me, right? And so it's really about, it seems to me, for him, it's about loving the entire person, right? And that is difficult, right? I think he doesn't pretend that it's not, right? But that really, he proceeds, in my view, in that book, on assuming that we all want to live a life of love, right? And that like the only, as he says, the only life really worth living, right, is a life full of love. And so what he's trying to clarify, it seems to me, is what does that actually entail, right? You know, and it's not enough to say, well, I love my family or I love my close friends or something like that. Like that simply isn't, I mean, that is a partial, right, you might say, achievement of the life of love, but it's not the whole, right? And it's not the totality of what it is to love well others. And that looks more like something, again, like treating even, say, a stranger as a cherished friend, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting how Kierkegaard has some ideas that are so applicable today, you know, particularly what we're going through in the world. It also, you know, I'm thinking about all his ideas on what is real, right? Because he has a lot. So those things, I think they're also fairly, you know, very interesting. And so
there's a lot of ways in which I think he could be explored for his relevance to, say, the internet age, right? You know, and that's something I've yet to develop. I have never published on, but I'm happy to talk about a little bit because I think you're absolutely right, is that he's a strikingly contemporary voice, right, despite having been dead for 150 years or so. For example, I mean, I'm thinking about what he has to say against what he calls comparison, right? So he has this idea that it's very dangerous for us to get caught up in making unfair or uncharitable comparisons between ourselves and others, right? And even in a mode of certainly like what we might call, you know, fear of missing out, right? Like, you know, that this idea that somehow, oh, if only I had that person's good looks or that person's opportunities or that person's resources or that person's money or that person's family, then I would really be happy. And he regards this as a very dangerous form of self-evasion, right? That essentially what I'm doing is I'm attempting to live vicariously through a person who does not exist, right? This is an idea I have made up in my own mind. And I am meanwhile failing to live the one life that I can live, which is my own, right? And so he tells a number of sort of parables and illustrative examples about how this can work, right? And for example, the one I think of is where he talks about how a lily is growing in a beautiful corner of the world, and the lily is visited by a bird who fills the lily's head with stories about how beautiful the royal lilies are on the other side of the valley, and how really, you know, if he wanted to be impressed by the life of a lily, he would go see that for himself. And he becomes so desirous of this, right, and he becomes so inspired by this spirit of sort of invidious comparison that he says, you know, well, take me there, right? And of course the sparrow uproots the lily and starts to fly, right, to this place where he's been told of all these wonders. And on the way, of course, the lily dies, right? You know, because he's been uprooted from his soil. Right. And I think Kierkegaard thinks that all of us as individuals really do have to bloom where we are planted, right? You know, that it cannot be the case that we allow ourselves to be distracted from our own existence by some kind of imagined better option or some kind of imagined other person's life that seems better than ours in some way. We have to be able to be content with who we are and where we are, right? And he sees this already, I think, because he's witnessing like the birth of what we would call today mass media, right? In his day, it's the newspaper, right? You know, but we see the same kind of dynamics played out in media today. It seems to me social media is rife with fear of missing out, right? Rife with the spirit of invidious comparison. And I think he believes it's the enemy of love, right? That, you know, to be caught up in comparisons like this is to fail to love others and to love yourself, right? You know, which he believes that self-love, properly understood, just is the same as loving others well, right? To love others well is to also love yourself properly, right? And so that's something that he feels like is missing, and that it's something that media are really having an influence in taking us away from ourselves, right? He says, look at the newspaper, right? It's written for something called the public. But who is the public, right? It's everyone and no one, right? It's everyone and no one at the same time, right? And so the anonymity, right, of sort of like a kind of false collective is one that was already troubling his mind in a way that I think he would, you know, be horrified to discover has just gotten, if anything, worse, right? You know, since he witnessed these phenomena.
Exactly. So speaking of Kierkegaard, you had a sort of a conference that you organized last year, and this is a really cool thing we had at New College last year. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we had a workshop this past spring around the time of Kierkegaard's birth, right? So sort of in celebration of his birthday. and also in commemoration of the fact that a portrait of Kierkegaard now hangs in College Hall. It was composed by a former student here at New College. And so we drew some attention to that and used that as a jumping off point for talking about the place of art and aesthetics in a good life, right, according to Kierkegaard. And so we had a few speakers from around the country and internationally come in and talk to us about lessons for the good life today that we can draw from Kierkegaard. And many of them touched on some of the ideas that I've spoken about briefly today. I've also just turned in a proposal for a follow-up event happening around the same time of year in 2026, which will be expanded and devoted to the topic of the moral imagination in Kierkegaard. So, which is another, it seems to me, topic that is very relevant to sort of the current state of our political discourse, right, in the divisiveness that we find around us. Moral imagination is something that Kierkegaard says is not just one capacity within the human being, but it's actually the capacity of all capacities. And he says it has an impact on our thinking, on our feeling, and on our willing, right? That like these things don't take place in the human spirit without being governed by the imagination, which essentially he views as a faculty that's open to possibilities, right? You know, and so to be able to have a strong developed imagination is the capacity to envision other people's experience, right? Even if they're different from myself, to imagine what the world looks like from their perspective, right? To present to myself feelings that are maybe not my own, or possibilities that don't belong to my horizon, but perhaps belong to another's. And so there's a wide range, I think, of applicability to what Kierkegaard calls the imagination, and it concerns a great deal more than just, say, you know, coming up with fantastical pictures or something in our minds, right? But really has to do with sort of how we are capable of thinking, feeling, and willing the possibilities that are presented to us, and thinking about how those might impact other people, and how I might try to come to some kind of insight or understanding into other people's experience of the world, even when it's not my own, right? And he thinks that that's a big part of, I think, moral formation, right? He thinks that, say, stories can do this to us, right? They can, you know, stories can teach us, right, sort of like what the experience of others is like, and how I might learn from that without having to make the same mistakes that other people have made, right? That I can envision possibilities either for my own selection and pursuit, or for my avoidance, right? You know, and that I can do that when I'm properly educated, as it were, through the moral imagination, without actually having to sort of go through experiences myself, right? I know myself well, always for Kierkegaard, by detour into the experience of someone else, right? I have no direct introspective knowledge of myself. I only see myself reflected back to me in dialogue, in conversation, or in even something like a narrative or a piece of art that shows me something about the human condition that I myself maybe don't have access to or haven't experienced directly.
Right. And this kind of explains why literature, you know, some writers have been drawn to Kierkegaard's writings, like Borges and Camus, you know, because of all this.
Absolutely, yeah. I think he's one of the few Western philosophers who's been influential on literature to a strong degree, almost as much, if not more than, to the degree that he's been influential, say, in philosophy or theology, right? And he himself, you know, is a tremendous writer. I mean, he's just a terrific, you know, stylist, and someone who's a joy to read because he invests just as much energy in the form of his expression as in the content of it, right? And so he's somebody who tells stories. He loved fairy tales. He loved drama. He loved ballet. And so he rehearses things like narratives and plays with different sort of narrative perspectives. He creates his own pseudonymous characters through which he composes his works, because he is somebody who I think believes that that's the only avenue to self-understanding, right? You know, is that we have to sort of take this kind of circuit through the experience of others, and that we have to see things in a different way and be provoked, as it were, from outside with that kind of shock of self-recognition, right? But that's something that always sneaks up on us, right? You know, and so it has to be communicated, as he said, indirectly, right? You know, that like the truth about ourselves is something that, you know, he likens it to being shot in the back, right? Like we have to be sort of wounded from behind, right? For us to sort of feel the sting of self-recognition. Like it will never sort of come at us head on, right? But will always be something that sort of, you know, sneaks up on us from behind, as it were.
Right. So let's talk classes just for a second we got left. What kind of classes do you teach, and do you have any favorites? Or any class that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, so I've taught a wide range of things just in the short time I've been here. I taught a seminar on meaning in life last fall. I taught a class on religious existentialism. This semester I'm teaching philosophy of religion, and I'm teaching a whole seminar just on Kierkegaard's works. Last semester I taught a class on early modern philosophy, and this spring I'll be teaching a class on medieval philosophy, which is something else that I've studied a good bit in graduate school, but haven't done quite as much work with in publication or research, but it's something that interests me and stays close to my heart. So I'm looking forward, especially perhaps, to teaching medieval philosophy in the spring. So
okay. Great.
Yeah, which is a rich period of actually, I think, very diverse sources, right?
Yes,
so,
for sure.
you know, if you broaden your perspective on the medieval period to include Islamic, Jewish, and Christian thinkers, right, you find that there's a really vibrant dialogue that goes on across the monotheistic traditions.
Yeah.
And there are some amazing works that are done beyond sort of the first sort of thinkers that we tend to confront, right?
And
so
Spain
it'll
is
be
one
a
of
rich
the
period.
epicenters of that.
That's true, yeah. So Cordoba was home to a great diversity of thought, and so we will definitely be looking at some writers from that era. So
Fantastic.
yeah, so that one's going to be fun.
Great.
Yeah. So, one thing that I wanted to ask you about, because, philosophy has been, the philosophy departments have been, disappearing in a lot of places. And, I think that New College, we're actually growing and we're strengthening philosophy.
Yep.
And it seems to me like in our mission and what we do here, philosophy is key because critical thinking. We've been talking about this, pushing critical thinking in times of AI. We need to learn how to. And so philosophy is a key element of that. What do you think?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's important to appreciate that the investment that's being made in a place like New College in philosophy is really bucking the national trend, right? If you follow the headlines, the majority of them have to do not with growing departments of philosophy, but squeezing them down, and in many cases, eliminating them altogether, right? So there are lots of places where we've seen this happening, and it's still ongoing, that the trend seems to be toward actually reducing commitment to philosophy as a discipline, shutting down departments, laying off entire faculties of philosophy. So this is a major problem right now, and if you're worried about the future of philosophic study in this country, you should be. Our department is growing, and the number of majors that we have is increasing. So we're getting a higher number of philosophy concentrators, and I think that's precisely because students are indeed looking for what you just said, which is to say, to equip themselves with perennial skills around critical thinking and around engagement with deep and difficult subject matter, right? There is a hunger, I think, on the part of young people, especially right now, for something like meaning in life, right? That they are looking for sources of meaningfulness, and philosophy is a rich repository, of resources for that very question. So, I tend to take an existential approach, I guess, and I would say that that's well supported by the fact that here we do put philosophy at the center of liberal arts education, and we do regard it as something that can prepare a person well for any number of possible career paths, right? All of which I think are going to require these kinds of abilities going forward that distinguish, say, a well-educated, well-formed human being from the kinds of tasks that AI is increasingly capable of doing, right? And so that means that we've got to double down on our commitment to the really traditional sort of skill sets, the traditional activities that philosophy allows the mind to kind of cultivate in order to make it possible for people to live well, and regardless of sort of how they choose to what kind of career they choose to pursue, right? And so that is something that I think is valuable, sort of no matter what, right, to students as they go forward, building adult lives, right?
Yeah.
And I remember I was stopped on the street once in Boston years after I had taught this student her philosophy class, and we just ran into each other out of the blue, and she said, my friends and I still talk about the things that we discussed in your class, and that's the power of philosophy, it seems to me, right? It's the kind of thing that no matter what, if you've benefited from it at the right time, at a formative time in your young adulthood, then it's the sort of thing that will stay with you, right? And that you'll find yourself coming back to, right?
Yeah. That's right.
And that sort of thing has happened to me more than once over the years. Yeah. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's great. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for
Thank
having
you.
me.
Yeah, thank you for coming. And like I said before, welcome to the team.
Yeah, the next time I'll be on the other side of the microphone.
Yep.
Exactly. So to all of you watching us and listening to us, remember, send us questions, comments. We'll be happy to answer. And we'll see you next week.